You're tuned into the Zealous Podcast. I'm your host, Rocky Snyder. This week, Daniel DeBrocke is joining me. He's a performance expert, strength conditioning coach. Used to be with Kabuki Strength as an educator. Now he's on his own. We're going to learn more about what he's been doing. But before we do that, check out the website, rockysnyder.com. Blogs, podcasts, online learning, CEUs for athletic trainers, physical therapists, strength coaches, personal trainers, heck, even chiropractors. Just go to rockysnyder.com for learning more information. And if you want to learn even more, perhaps in the way of a master's of science degree, then go to satantacollege.com. They've got Masters of Science in Applied Sports Biomechanics and Movement Science, performance coaching. Heck, they've got one on applied sport and exercise psychology, as well as sports injuries and return to performance management. Just go to satantacollege.com, enter RS10 for 10% off tuition today. Follow us on Instagram at Rocky_Snyder. You know, if you haven't subscribed yet, do yourself a favor and click the button, please. Enjoy the show. Well, Daniel, it's a treat for me to have you on because you are in an environment, an arena, which we haven't really touched upon, and that is training and educator, kind of outside the confines of collegiate and professional sports, although I know you've delved into it. So before we get underway, I just want to welcome you on to the Zealous Podcast, and let's hear from you.
Yeah, I guess for starters, I want to say thank you for having me on. It's always great to be able to connect with other people in the industry and just be able to kind of chat about things we're both passionate about and experienced in. So thank you for having me on.
My pleasure. Now, uh, as we talked before we hit the record button, you're a man with great spiritual principles and a certain path, and I want to honor that. And if you want to give some words before we get really underway, prayer or sentiments, this would be a wonderful time.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you for allowing that, by the way. So, um, Heavenly Father, I pray that you guide my words, my actions, and my conduct, so that I can be of the most value to the listeners. I pray that you speak life through my words and not death, and that what I say is valuable and helps other people on their journey and ultimately leads them closer to you in some form or another. And I pray this in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Also, for anyone who's not Christian out there, when I say speak life, not death, that is scriptural, so that probably doesn't make sense to some people, but just for a little bit of added context.
I gotcha. Well, thank you for that. And if you don't mind, just give the listening audience a little bit of a background of yourself. And not that you have to qualify yourself by any stretch, but I know that you're a Golden Glove champion, Muay Thai's in your background, powerlifting, and so on. But I want to hear what your life's path has been.
Yeah, so um, it's been a bit odd, I guess, in retrospect, but yeah, I started out, I was not fit or athletic or anything like that, to be honest. I was deeply insecure and unfit and not genetically gifted or anything like that. And I guess I was just scared all the time. I had a bit of a difficult upbringing, and so eventually I decided that I needed to learn how to defend myself. I need to learn how to fight. And I started learning, and um, then I just took it very seriously. And I would train 6 hours a day, 7 days a week, and I did that for a very, very long time. I started fighting, and I'd win, and I was like, "Oh, okay, I got lucky," and then I'd win again, and I eventually realized that I had a bit of an aptitude, and then over time, yeah, I won the Golden Gloves, and I fought in boxing and Muay Thai. I did jiu-jitsu as well and competed in that, but really where I excelled was boxing and Muay Thai. And then after I'd retired from that, I I had this big gap in my life, I guess, because I didn't really have a whole lot of friends because my life was so consumed with my training. Like that was what I did. And so I'd go to work because I was a chef as well, and so I'd go to work and then I'd come home and I would literally just sit on the couch and wait because I didn't have a television. I would just read and I would just wait for the next day. And I did that for a couple weeks and realized very quickly, okay, this is not sustainable. So I need to find something else to do. And one of the guys that I used to coach at boxing was him and his brother were like multiple time Olympians. I think they won silver medal or something like that in Canada bobsleigh. So phenomenal athletes. And I think his name was Mark LeBlanc or something like that. But he was like an OG in the bobsleigh world, I guess. I think that's his name. This is so long ago, so I apologize if I got his name wrong. But at any rate, and he was a phenomenal athlete, just in wild shape, crazy explosive, powerful, fast, and a really impressive physique. And so I was like, you know what, that looks like a lot of fun. I'd like to be able to do that stuff. And so I decided to go and check out the bobsleigh stuff. And one of the prereqs was, power clean and stuff like that. And so I was like, okay, like I can do the sprints, I can do all these other things, but I don't really know what this Olympic weightlifting thing is. So I started doing that and realized pretty quickly that that was a lot more fun than bobsleigh. So I just started doing that. And I didn't get very far in that. I got to well, because at the time I was working such insane hours, I was only sleeping about 4 hours a night because of how much I worked. And so obviously I wasn't able to recover. And we were training just really hard. And so I just couldn't recover. So I did make a lot of progress, but I think I only got up to like a 150 something clean and jerk, at like maybe 88 kilos or 86 kilos. So I wasn't very strong. I was strong-ish, but nothing crazy. And after I left and I started my own company, I had a lot more time on my hands, and so I could sleep more. I recovered better, but I also had been injured, and so I had transitioned to powerlifting. And so then, at that point, that's where I started actually getting strong, started to gain some more size and things like that. And yeah, and then that was basically it for me. Like when I started Olympic weightlifting, that's actually how I became a coach, was because one of the guys there had heard about my fighting acumen. Was like, "Oh, have you ever thought about being a coach?" And I was like, "Not really." And then he's like, "Well, if you go to school, get a diploma or whatever, like we'll hire you." And that's basically how it kicked off. And so that's basically how it went.
That's wonderful. So, for the audience who's only listening to the audio portion of this podcast and are not watching the video, I just got to explain that Daniel's physique is reminiscent of the mountain in Game of Thrones. That's
Not
what
not
I'm
quite.
getting through.
Not quite.
Yeah, well, your shoulders have their own zip code, brother. They just wide, and I'm thinking Magnus, and things of that nature with you. And of course, you're from your lineage is from that area, Dutch,
Netherlands. Yeah.
the Netherlands, yes. And so, just picture that in your mind as we're talking here. Now, it's interesting. We've got one thing in common. We're both working on the line or as chefs at one point in time. And I'm just curious, how does that play? Does it play a role in what you do these days in any way?
None. None, because I cooked in fine dining. I was a chef in fine dining, and so
Oh,
we like I mean the three main ingredients in all French cooking is butter, butter, and butter, right?
yes.
So, as a chef, yeah, I'm sure you get that as well. But so it really doesn't. My diet is very simplistic. The behavioral modulation interventions that I implement with clients and athletes is very simplistic. And in my experience, the more that people ask for like, recipe books and variety and variability in their diet, the less success they have. And I think that's pretty fairly obvious as to why. And so it really doesn't. At some point, I have thought about maybe sitting down and coming up with some very simple tactics, more so maybe having like like a YouTube series, because I have a YouTube channel, right? So maybe having a YouTube series where I might teach them cooking techniques. So it's like, here's how to sear something and then finish it in the oven. Here's how to, basic knife skills, things like that, that actually would allow you to make really delicious food, or even just like marinades that are low calorie. Like I think things like that, that are very, very simple, that are just basic fundamental cooking, um, could be beneficial, but it's just really not anything that I've ever really seriously considered. It might be something down the road, but I'm so busy now that I just don't have the bandwidth for it. Yeah.
I'm rather slow-witted, and I'm trying to keep up with you there when you say if you broaden your menu, the likelihood of like adherence to a program diminishes.
Mhm.
Um, how so? How is that? rather than just sticking with basic, the what you know to be good and just staying with that? How is it that broadening out your recipes, so to speak?
Would it have a negative impact? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, great question. So, um, essentially, when you look at variability, you're always introducing new potential points of error, right? So, if you have a recipe where you're doing, you've got 50 different ingredients, well, you have 50 different opportunities to create larger measurement error, right? Also, there's something called the food palatability reward hypothesis, where if you eat, and it doesn't necessarily need to be ultra processed, but let's just call it ultra processed and in another category, but they are similar, just highly palatable foods, right? So if you eat really delicious foods, it actually creates this uptick of hedonic pursuits of eating. So you actually desire to consume more of those foods. Also, hyperpalatable foods generally are much easier to eat. So you eat them faster, and satiety signals generally take about 20, 30 minutes-ish to kick in for, individuals. And so if you're eating faster, the probability that you're going to overeat is much higher. If you're eating 4 times a day, 5 times a day, 7 times a day, if you're a very large athlete, then we have, again, 7 opportunities to overconsume food or underconsume, depending on what it is that we're doing, right? Although the probability would lean towards overconsumption. And so essentially you want to keep things as simple as possible. Like imagine creating a program where every single week you're doing something completely different. Even West Side, so West Side Barbell for any strength athletes was like a conjugate system, and they would have a lot of variability. Even though they had a lot of variability, one, the athletes were super high level, so their neurological system was already very well ingrained when it comes to the motor patterns of the big three lifts and their variants. That being said, they still had staples that they did. They still had speed work and they had max effort work. So those things, even though the modality or the implement was maybe different, what they're doing was still fundamentally very similar. And so the more variability you have, the less certainty you have. And so again, it's not a guarantee. It's just in my coaching practice, I've been coaching for 12, 13, whatever years, however many years it's been. Um, well, 15, yeah, I think 13 years as of now. But that's just been my experience. Whereas if you keep things more standard, it ends up being a lot better. And again, these things are subject to change depending on the context. For a newer individual, someone who's maybe more novice, that is 100% true. For someone who's very advanced, who's very, deeply ingrained routines and systems and behaviors, then you have a lot more flexibility. But I'm always a big believer of first, let's learn the rules before we start manipulating or personalizing things. Kind of like, Floyd Mayweather fights in like the Philly shell like this, right? But you never go to a boxing gym where they teach that. No one's going to teach you that because that's not fundamentals, right? You learn that after you become exceptional, right? And so I would say first you learn the fundamentals, then you can be like, okay, you want to fight like Roy Jones? You want to fight like, like Floyd Mayweather or Muhammad Ali with their hands down? Sure, that's fine, but are you exceptional first? And that's kind of the rationale behind it. Sorry for the long-winded answer, but
Not at all, not at all. You're making my dreams come true, and that dream is to never be the smartest guy in the room, and I really appreciate that. So, what I'm getting from that is we started talking about nutritional selections, dietary selections, and you carried it over to all aspects of life. Start with the fundamentals and become a master of that before advancing on to other things, whether that be in the nutritional realm, the exercise realm, or just living in everyday life. Would you say that's pretty accurate?
yeah, I mean, I think there's other elements to it, but yeah, more or less.
I'm curious about your coaching because you intimate that you were not the most extroverted individual growing up, and somebody suggests that you become a coach. I would love to learn more about the transformation that occurred within your psyche, within your being, transitioning from that earlier rendition to becoming Coach Daniel DeBrocke.
I don't know that anything's changed. I'm still extremely shy as an individual. I'm very introverted. So, as an example, I used to train at a gym called the Strength Edge. Shout out to Andrew and all the crew there. So, we have a lot of very strong guys. To put this into context, there's 7 or 8 people who deadlift over 800, and a guy who squats over 1,000. This is raw lifting, not equipped, by the way. So these are very strong individuals. And so we'd all train together for years. I was there for about 5 years, and I didn't speak to anyone for the first 2 or 3 years. I get very uncomfortable around new people. But oddly enough, I can speak at a conference in front of hundreds of people, and that's not a big deal. But I think it's literally just more that it's learned behavior, but it's still not anything that's really internalized. And so I think as a coach, you have to learn how to be personable. You have to learn how to connect with people. You have to learn how to express empathy, be, gracious and compassionate and understanding and introspective and all sorts of different, skill sets. And these are kind of the soft skills of coaching, so you can increase buy-in and execution. But um, in spite of that, I think just my nature is I am more introverted. I am more shy. I don't feel comfortable talking to new people. Even though I can, it's still not something that's feels really normal to me, you know?
Yeah, yeah, I do. I honestly do. And you, the listening audience may not realize, but I am very similar in that way. I was rather shy growing up, especially when it came toward the opposite sex, and going into large gatherings, rooms, and conferences. I would find myself becoming just the one that stayed over on the corner against the wall, didn't integrate with anybody, and then it dawned on me that these people are experts on them in one topic. Everyone has one topic they're an expert in, and that's themselves. So if I just became curious and went up to somebody who looked like they were having the same kind of environment that I was encountering, then I just go over to them and ask them questions like I'm doing right now. And boy, it sure helped me a lot, and to the point where now I'm doing this on a weekly basis with people I've never met and yet feel connected at the same time. So I totally understand what you're saying. Now, you had been an educator for Kabuki Strength and no longer doing that, but started your own company and there's an educational component there. Would you mind kind of elaborating on that?
Yeah, so I was director of education at Kabuki. I worked with them for about 3 years and then left, I think 2023, kind of before all the craziness happened with them. But yeah, and so for me, a huge aspect of my coaching is education. So when I work with clients, and I use client and athlete interchangeably, just FYI. Um, But when I work with them, there's a massive, massive educational component because I'm a very, very hands-on coach. I'm incredibly meticulous with, if we're doing like video reviews or biomechanics assessments on like the execution of particular movements or patterns. Um, these are things that I really am meticulous on. I go very deep on. And so through that process, I educate. If I'm coaching someone on a dietary, like on their nutrition, there's a lot of stuff that's going to go on there. I coach people on lifestyle. We coach people on all sorts of facets of their life because people are not, you can't separate an individual from their context, right? And so this kind of goes into the biopsychosocial model. And so I've lectured on this, I've published on these things before. Like this is, I think actually what I'm most known for is my, I guess, expertise on behavior modulation, specifically regarding nutrition. But it applies to kind of all aspects of performance, right? Because if we look at performance as a matter of inputs and outputs, we have stress, we have, general health, we have sleep, we have recovery, we have the training stimulus itself, we've got dietary interventions, we've got supplementation. If they're using exogenous supplements like PEDs or whatever, like I don't really mess around with that. Like I do coach athletes that are enhanced, but I don't know enough about that stuff to feel comfortable um, making recommendations or suggestions. So I do have people that I would refer out to for that, but outside of that, like that's still going to affect how they respond to things. So understanding how things all integrate and work together is extremely important. Like if you're looking at someone's performance and it's down, and they might not know why, but then I look at the data and I say, okay, well, it's very clear why because of X, Y, and Z. And so I'm big on collecting data. I'm big on having lots and lots of communication with my athletes. Like I talk to them probably 5, 7 times a week, most of them anyways. It's extremely important in my mind to have really strong communication, understand what's going on, understand the recovery. If they're enjoying the training, like buy-in is so, so important. Um, and so throughout that entire process, I'm asking for stuff, but then I'm also educating. And so if I have someone who's newer, and let's say they're just, looking to build some general strength and they're doing like a lateral raise. I'm going to keep things pretty basic. I'm going to say, hey, I want you to just pause briefly at the top and then lower down a little bit slower. Maybe count to like three by the time you get down, then come up with control. So it's going to be something like that. If I'm working with someone who's a little bit more advanced, I might talk to them about like their scapular mechanics. I might talk to them about their thoracic positioning, especially for more advanced athletes. You actually do get structural changes, not just like more muscle, thicker tendon, stuff like that. But you actually get a change in the shape of your rib cage, in the structure of your pelvis, and like because when you have that much load compressing you over time, it does change your morphology, or at least it can, and it does for many people. And so these are all things that, depending on the individual, depending on the context, need to be understood effectively, especially if I'm giving them something and they don't understand it. They're like, why are we doing this? This doesn't make any sense. They need to understand why in order to get that buy-in so they can do it and they can do it to the degree of execution that's required to get the desired outcome. And so education is extremely important. Then when we talk about people who have more, disordered eating type behavior, whether it's subclinical or full-blown clinical, that's very relevant. Just even something as simple as understanding what the process looks like. So like, okay, I'm coming to build a bunch of muscle and turn into a physique athlete. What does that process actually look like? What are the things you can expect? So educating people around that and navigating through challenges is very, very important because I think people often have preconceptions that are just wildly inaccurate. And because of that, they measure their current experience against a completely arbitrary assessment of what they believe the process looks like. And because of that, they're like, oh, I'm a failure if I mess up, or oh, this or oh, that. And it's just like, so it's completely counterproductive. So education is extremely important in all facets, in my opinion. But again, that's also just kind of how I operate because for me, it's very important to understand what I'm doing. And so that's also one of the reasons why it's such a weighty part or aspect of my own coaching process.
You mentioned, by the way, that was great. Great response. Really appreciate that. You mentioned the compressive loading, and of course, with powerlifting and physique training and so on, we have continuous compression on the structure, and therefore, we're going to see bony structures change alignment and so on. How much time do you design into a program with decompression? Is there, and what might that look like if you do? I don't want to assume anything.
So, I mean, it's just going to depend on the individual. Like, there are some guys who are crazy freak athletes, and I look at them and I'm like, you move phenomenally. I don't know how you have no injuries. I don't know how you have no major restrictions. You move phenomenally. And then there's people who are super weak who like have zero hip internal rotation, who just because of their lifestyle or whatever. And then there's everyone in between, right? And so it really is going to be context dependent and dependent on what the individual needs, because it's again, it's very layered because sometimes there's functional adaptations. But if those functional adaptations become a little too extreme, then it becomes problematic, right? So a great example would be you look at the left and right arms of a pitcher and their external rotation capacity, completely different. But one is functionally beneficial. But if it goes too far beyond, a certain point, then it actually becomes counterproductive again. So we just need to make sure that we're keeping things within certain functional margins. The functionality is going to be determined based on sport specificity as well as general health. I know a lot of people like to say that, oh, health and performance are at odds with one another. And in my opinion, I think that's a very silly and naive statement because how can that possibly be? Because if you are unhealthy, you cannot perform long term. Performance is not something that happens in 6 weeks. And then I often hear as a rebuttal, what about someone who just takes a bunch of tren and testosterone and has a massive, crazy performance in powerlifting or strongman? Sure. How long are they going to last for before they die? Probably not very long, right? And we see this all the time. So if you want to perform long term, you have to think about your health and longevity. And so I don't think that those things are separated. I certainly don't think that they're at odds. And when it comes to decompression or really any sort of intervention strategy to regain, let's say, access to range of motion or certain functional capacities or maybe tissue capacity or stability at certain end ranges, anything that we're trying to restore, let's say, is really going to be contingent on what the athlete is presenting with and whether or not it's rate limiting factors. There might be something where I'm like, okay, this is something we need to address, but because it's not like a main issue, it's not limiting their performance, they're not experiencing sort of symptoms that are causing pain or discomfort. We really don't need to be as aggressive with that. We can kind of slow build that and prioritize other things that are going to have a larger magnitude of effect, especially in the short term. So it's a bit of a loaded question, but everything has to be done based on a very thorough assessment of the athlete, of their needs, of the context, and things like that. Like some things, literally, if an individual is experiencing pain, sometimes just reducing stress and teaching effective stress management protocols, breathing practices to downregulate their nervous system, and have them being more effective at shifting from sympathetic to parasympathetic can be enough to access additional range of motion. It can be enough to just alleviate pain symptomology and all sorts of stuff. So there's a lot of different levers we can pull, but it really is context dependent.
Fabulous. So you have transitioned your focus, shall we say, with your clients and athletes. The majority, as I understand it, are physique competitors, I guess you would say, bodybuilding and the like, from previous, maybe boxing, Olympic weightlifting, and so on, powerlifting. Uh, Obviously the competition has grown enormously, and I think in part thanks to Instagram and other social media sites that people can really post the changes in their body. It inspires others to do it, uh, and with that, it's, I won't say it's a double-edged sword, but it's very easy to fall prey to misinformation that is put out by individuals that are saying, because it worked for me, here's how everybody else has to do it. Do you find yourself having to battle a lot of misinformation? Is that a role that, one of the bigger roles that you play, or do you just kind of say, we're going to put that off to the side? Here's what I'd like to share with you. How do you go about that?
Yeah, so I'm going to take a step back and just one quick correction because I don't want to
Please.
misrepresent myself. Um, I'm a strength physique coach, but I don't I'm not like an IFBB bodybuilding contest prep coach. Like that's not what I am. I primarily coach strength athletes and physique-based athletes, but from the physique side, I don't necessarily really specialize in the competitive bodybuilding. Like I'll make
Ah,
you look crazy, I'll make you look like a bodybuilder, but I don't really dabble in like competitive bodybuilding, if that makes sense.
yes.
And if I do, it's just on very rare requests because I specifically would rather refer out because it's not something that I really want to mess with too much, at least right now. Just that's kind of like a finer point, but I just didn't want
Thank
to
you.
misrepresent myself and my
I
abilities.
appreciate the clarity.
Um, but in terms of misinformation, I really don't think about it that much, to be honest. I know there's a lot of people like Lane Norton and Alan Aragon and a lot of other people out there who are really like zealous about, I gotta tackle the misinformation, I gotta do all this, and it is what it is. I don't think it's good or bad. I don't necessarily have anything to say about it, but I guess for me, I just don't think it's necessary. Um, and I'm speaking solely for myself in the sense that when I come to talk to someone and they have preconceptions around training, diet, whatever, I just have a conversation with them and then I just ask them questions. So if they believe X, Y, Z and that's not correct, I'll just say, okay, why? And then they tell me. And then I say, okay, but why that? They tell me why that, why that. After about two or three questions, pretty quickly they find out, oh, I don't know. And then at that point, that's when I might say, okay, well, do you mind if I share some of my own experience and my own education on this? And they're like, well, of course. And then I just kind of say what the real reality of the situation is. But I try very, very hard to not be judgmental, to not be like arrogant in quote unquote correcting people because I do think that's a big problem in the fitness industry. I've definitely been guilty of that myself, so I'm not going to put myself on a pedestal. I have a
As
massive
have I.
ego, and I constantly have to pray for humility and humble myself constantly. Um, and so, but I've just noticed that, and I have conversations with people. I think I don't really have to overcome a lot because people can sense my sincerity. I'm not trying to fit them into a mold. I'm just trying to help. And there might be times where I know what they're doing is wrong and I will tell them as much, but I'll say, if you still want to try it, I will try it with you. So long as it's not like dangerous or anything like that. I'll say, I'll try it with you and I'll run you through the protocol. Here's what I believe is going to happen. And then if that happens, would you be open to doing what I'm suggesting? And then they'll say yes, and I run them through that. And sure enough, it happens exactly how I predicted it would because it's fairly obvious. And then they say, okay. And then now they're bought in. Although even that, if I'm being honest, is quite rare. I don't generally have to overcome a lot of misinformation or anything like that because like they're coming to me as the expert, you know?
Certainly.
And like and I have like I produced some pretty insane results, like with my athletes in terms of high level strength athletes, in terms of like crazy physiques, and things like that. And so I think that kind of speaks for itself. Plus, I also I really just believe that the conversation that we have is important because they can tell they're talking to a real person. Like I'm not trying to, pull the wool over their eyes or anything like that. I'm just like a normal person, like everyone else. And I think that people really enjoy that as opposed to um, me kind of like putting myself up above them and I'm like, I'm the expert, you know what I mean? Like, so I would
Yeah.
suspect that's kind of what it is. And I think that's one of the reasons why I get more buy-in. It's probably just because of the conversations that we have, to be honest. Um, yeah, sorry, I was kind of like thinking about that as we're going through it. I've never had to answer that question, so I wish it was a bit more
No,
concise.
I love it. I love it. And it really boils down to a conversation, that interpersonal communication that you have with somebody. And who's become a good friend, Chase Coe, who developed something called the GOAT Mind. He's based out of Florida and greatest of all time mind. And he he incorporates scripture with his goal setting with his clients that are primarily top level athletes. And everyone can have their own belief system. And yet at the same time, he feels that there's some great, powerful truths in there to evoke greatness from individuals. And so if you don't mind, because we started with a prayer on this podcast, I would love if you're okay, just explaining how do you incorporate your beliefs within your training if that's something that you do.
It absolutely is. So I mean, I've got an ESV Bible over here, study Bible, and that's there for a reason. I want people to see it. I want people to understand this is part of who I am. This is part of my company. Um, so as I mentioned earlier, a big aspect of the coaching process is just going to be coaching the actual individual themselves. People are not, you can't separate people from their context. I've had athletes where their mothers have died, where they've had like major tragedies, where they find out that they have a serious physical illness like cancer, brain cancer, really serious things. And so you can't just say, well, just do the thing. You can't just, you need to really treat them like a human being. And that boils down to the relationship you have with them. And so oftentimes when I think it's appropriate, I will just ask and say, hey, are you religious? A lot of the times they say no, sometimes they say yes. And I'll just say, okay, well, are you open to maybe me sharing a little bit about my own experience with my faith and how I think that's relevant for you? Now, if they say yes, then I will. If they say no, then totally no worries. I'm not here to force anything on anyone. I think if you come to Christ, it has to be very organic. I know that if I was forced to it, I would absolutely have like run in the opposite direction. So, um, but again, I think that because I have that relationship with them initially, and because I'm constantly being very mindful about boundaries, I think they, have a justified reason to trust me. And so then at that point, I say, okay. Um, for instance, I had an individual who's just chronically stressed, just working insane hours, and like it's just their pattern. They're stuck in that as a pattern. And so, like, I will talk to them about like what they're doing, like what is the purpose of your life, like what you know what I mean. And so now we're getting a little bit more philosophical, a little bit more metaphysical, and so we'll have sometimes very deep conversations, and I might guide them to certain scriptures, so Sermon on the Mount, um, do not worry, like look at the birds. The birds do not sow and store away, and yet they are fed. And are you not worth more than the birds of the air? And so there's so many you know, scripture or so many verses in scripture that talk about anxiety or worry or stress. Christ says, lay your burdens on me. He says, um, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. There's so many different things. And so I might talk to them about stuff like that. And as it pertains to them, I usually try and share my own personal experience. Um, that has some sort of relevance, obviously, and then talk about scripture in that way and say, here's why that's relevant. So for instance, if like a client is really struggling to just kind of take a step back, reduce the load on the bar because their identity is I'm a high performance athlete, but we're like, hey, that's not you right now. You're injured. We need to do this. We need to build you back up. That's very difficult sometimes to accept. So I might just talk about that. I might pray for them. I might give them audiobooks or like a sermon that I've heard or something that I think is going to help. Now, I don't try and just inject faith wherever I can. Like
Sure.
if it's appropriate and if I think it's going to help, then I'll do that. If I think that, like let's call it a secular whatever, that's not accurate, but like if it's an article that has nothing to do with faith, but it's going to be more appropriate, that's what I'm going to do. So I'm just looking to help them. And um, it's been really cool to see actually because I talk quite openly about my faith on Instagram. And the number of people who've reached out to me who've told me, and even clients who've converted, who have started going to church, who have started reading, the Gospels and things like that, and they've mentioned to me like, wow, this is something that actually is giving me like peace, you know. Um, and you see that transformation. It's really incredible to see. And I'm definitely, I have to say right off the bat, that has nothing to do with me, and that has everything to do with God, because I can't change anyone's mind. But when you read scripture and you're open to it, God will speak through scripture. And so when I see that happening and I see the transformation where these people who are chronically anxious, working just ridiculous hours, sleeping 3 hours a night, and that's not an exaggeration either way, by the way, and I see them change where they get more sleep. They start to calm down. They start to slow down. They stop prioritizing their business over their health. And then once they do that, the funny thing is their business starts going better, you know? And so I think in those senses, it's been really encouraging to see the transformation in them. And like I said, I can't take credit for that because my experience with faith is still led by God. So I have to give all credit to him. And it's been really cool to see, but I don't necessarily have like a way. It's more like if I kind of get the sense that that's going to be the most appropriate thing. Um, yeah, these are tough questions you're asking. I've never really thought about them. Sorry. So I hope that makes sense, but I'm
It
sure it
makes
does.
complete sense. Living in the now, having awareness, being in the moment, all those things, universal spiritual principles and through your eyes is really quite wonderful. Now you mentioned that before we hit the record button, you've done a lot of podcasts in the last year and you're kind of over it. So I do have to say I'm honored and grateful that you would take time out and have a conversation with me because of your schedule is such that you travel quite a bit and offer presentations and educational content to those in our industry. What does this year look like for you as 2025 comes around? Where will Daniel DeBrocke be traveling if some people wanted to connect with you or be in person to one of your events? What's that looking like?
So I actually do love speaking. I do love podcasts. I just sometimes don't have the bandwidth for it. This year, I actually explicitly was like, unless something really, really big comes up, I'm not gonna accept it. So at the moment, I don't have any plans for
Okay.
travel or speaking or anything like that. And that might change, but right now with my company, I'm going through a big push. So I just hired on some more staff, and so I'm really trying to kind of push the growth of one aspect of my business. And so because of that, that's the primary focus, and everything else is just kind of back burner. Because I mean,
Got it.
speaking like I mean, I spoke at the NSCA, was it like the national conference or whatever something like I can't remember exactly what it was. Spoken it last year, and I don't even think they paid me yet, to be honest. And by the way, that's not a knock on that. I haven't even reached out to them. I haven't even reached out to them for like the reimbursement for the flights, the hotels, and then the payment or whatever. So I actually should get on that, but you don't make crazy money from that. That's something I
No.
do because I love speaking. I love education. I do it for that reason. Plus, it's good exposure and you get to meet cool people and stuff like that, which is a bonus. But I do it because I love it, not necessarily because I'm like, oh, this is really making me a bunch of bank. And so for this year, I just kind of have to stick with my priorities because I'm a great coach. I'm not a great businessman. So I need to take this year to really make sure I get my business acumen up to a certain point. And so, like, yeah, there are certain people where if they ask me to come out, I'm going to because I feel very indebted to them for what they've done for my career. But outside of that, probably not going to be doing too much.
Well, if it makes you feel better, being a great coach and a great businessman is not something that is a common occurrence. So don't feel like you're alone in that world. And I can speak from experience myself.
Yeah.
Now, I'm I'm curious. This will probably be one of my last questions, though, and I really appreciate your time so far. But you're in Calgary,
Mhm.
and I'm in the States. From your perspective, what's the difference between the our industry in Canada versus the United States? What are the main differences, if there are any?
I'm not sure I'd really know. I mean, I know fitness is way bigger in the US, um, but I don't know that I know. I kind of think that Canada is sort of like the little sister of America. We just kind of like follow suit. Whatever you guys do, Canadians tend to do. Um,
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that I would really know any major differences. I mean, I think it'd be easier for me to tell differences between here and like, Eastern Western Europe, right? Because like it's not as big over there and like it's a lot more specialized. If you're gonna go to a training gym, you're gonna find a lot more specialty gyms with elite powerlifters or elite athletes or something like that. But outside of that, I don't know. I think it's just I think in the US, well, I'm not sure, but there's this kind of boom of like wannabe influencers you know,
Mm.
where I think there was a poll done not too long ago, and I think it was like high school kids where 70% or 80%, some astronomical number, when asked what they wanted to be when they grew up, said, I want to be an influencer. And it's so disappointing. Um, because I think it kind of sort of it demonstrates that people just want something for nothing. And there's this massive void in people's lives, I think, and they want fame, they want to claim, they want love and acceptance, which are all, some of them anyways are really good and normal things. But then I think some of it is like, why do you want fame? Like why do you want certain things that aren't inherently beneficial in any way, shape, or form? Um, and so I think that's probably a lot bigger in the US than it is in Canada,
Mhm.
but I may be mistaken. But that would really be the only thing, and that's me grasping at straws. So I don't know.
No.
If I'm being honest, I really don't pay attention to what other people are doing. Like I have social media, but I'm not on social media. I think it's poison for your brain. Like I don't watch television. I don't watch any of that stuff. Like I stay focused on my work, my faith, my training, my relationships. That's pretty much it.
And yet you are guided. You are influenced, and not by those individuals that you just named, but perhaps others, mentors, teachers, coaches. If you don't mind,
Absolutely.
who
Yeah.
who would those people be? If you want to say a few names, because I would love to investigate.
There are honestly so many people who have helped me in my career. Recently and early on, I could list like I guess dozens. I'll list a couple. So Mike Israetel has been a phenomenal help to me. Dave Tate, huge help. Chris Duffin, huge help. Andrew Coates, great help. Um, like there's honestly way too many to even like name on here.
That's a good
Um,
start.
but yeah, those people have all been tremendously helpful. Greg Knuckles, even just for like certain things, like helping me with like a U.S. visa and offering me like letters of recommendation, things like that, like super, super helpful. Um, and just giving me different opportunities. And that I don't need to necessarily go into, but all of those people have been tremendously helpful for my career, for my own development. And then, the people, actually, a couple people at my church. So, they guaranteed are not going to watch this, but Pastor Josh, Pastor Tim, and then one of the other members, Robin, has been incredible for just reaching out and discipling me and giving me guidance. Some of them are very successful in business, and so they kind of help there, and others are very successful in their relationships. Others are just like, you know, for scripture and stuff like that. And so all three offer very different elements of discipleship and mentorship that is invaluable to me. So there's so many people who have helped me along the way in my church and then also just professionally, as some of the names already mentioned. So I'm sure I've forgotten like at least dozens,
Well,
but there's
no
lots of names.
problem.
Those
I'm
those
sure
are those are some of the
no
big
one will
ones
take it
for sure.
personal.
Yeah.
So, and then in closing, I'll guess for those that want to follow Daniel DeBrocke, I don't know if Double D is a nickname that people give you or not, but I could see how it would fit if it did. But Daniel, if people wanted to follow you, say on Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, or Snapchat or whatever, how do they go about that?
So I think I'm pretty sure I have a Facebook, but like I've got some other channels as well. But realistically, the only ones that I actually use are going to be Instagram and YouTube. I'm redeveloping the website right now, and so I don't really do anything through my website at the moment. So that's not really going to be a good place. But yeah, Daniel_DeBrocke. That's my YouTube. That's my Instagram. YouTube and Instagram is that's where I'm actually active at the moment. And so that's going to be the best way to reach me.
Well, this has been an honor, and I again thank you so much for your time. My selfish pursuit of learning has been accomplished once again. And for the listening audience, if you were alongside me and were able to learn something, I hope you have, because there was a tremendous amount of insight that you've shared. So thank you again for being on.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity to, one, connect with you and just learn a little bit more about you, as well as speak to your audience. And I hope they got something out of today's conversation.
Well, that's it for this episode. Whew, I feel like I just ate a full course meal, and I'm thinking you did too. Thank you, Daniel, for coming on, and good luck into the future wherever your educational path takes you. Speaking of educational paths, go to rockysnyder.com. Check out my website if you need continuing education before the end of the year, or you just want to learn a little bit outside the box. We've got online learning as well as in-person events coming up, and we'll be telling you a little bit more as the year progresses. Be sure to check out setantacollege.com. Remember, you've got that 10% off discount code RS10. And if you haven't followed us on Instagram, shame on you. Just go to @Rocky_Snyder. While you're there, check out my book, Return to Center. And we'll see you next week.